We're looking at a lesson this morning that it will be in the theme that we'll be looking at for this month, which is to glorify God, glorifying God. And we are going to be looking at a lesson talking about glorifying God as school starts back. Now, as we look at that very thought within itself, one of the things that we need to realize, and I hope that we will see as we go through this lesson set out before us, and while I may not point it out every single time, I leave it to you to take and to apply it. But we're going to find that these principles that we're talking about, it's not just applied to students, but it's applied to each and every one of us within our lives as Christians today. Now, we find that no doubt we all have different opportunities to be around people within the world. And some of those opportunities we'll talk about today, no doubt, go into that of the line of a student. But yet, again, I believe that there's application that can be found for each and every one of us. As I started writing the lesson, I was put it down on the very first line that the countdown to summer break has begun, or the end of summer break has begun. And I realized, well, that's pretty much already over with because some were starting to go back to school pretty early in the week last week. But as I think about that of summer break being over for that of the students and the staff, we know that they are back at it. Whether they want to be or not, they are back at it. I'm sure that so many of these young kids are just ready to get to school on Monday morning and to really get going with their first full week, I believe it would be. Just along with the teachers too, right? But whenever it gets down to it, what comes up is new schedules, new classes, new friends, new challenges, new opportunities. There's a lot of new that takes place whenever we find that one is going into that of the school setting. I think about that of the academic year. And while it may be a new academic year for those who are going to school, there's also a new opportunity that's given unto you. I think a lot of times the way that maybe it's viewed and when we go to school is maybe it's new textbooks or new backpacks or things along that line, but it's also an opportunity to have a renewed commitment to God. See, I believe that's one of those statements can be made, and that is true for each and every one of us in our lives. Every day we wake up, every day we are blessed with life. We have a new opportunity to revive our commitment for God. When we think about that powerful thought within itself of how we are able to glorify God within that of our lives, I want us to look at it within the sense today of talking about it in the light of school starting back. And again, as we've said, this applies for every student, for every teacher, for every staff member, for every parent for that matter. And indeed, when we take and we look at this, as I've already asked, to make application to our lives, each and every one of us, as we go about whatever the scenario may be, maybe it's work, maybe it's a life of retirement, maybe it's being around family, being around friends, wherever it is, let us know. There's no doubt that we can make a difference, that we can glorify God in the way that we live out our lives. The first thought I want us to take and to look at is the call to glorify God. As we look at that call within itself to glorify God, there's a text that's brought out in the book of 1 Corinthians in chapter 10 and in verse 31. And as I think about these words here that Paul brought forth, he said, whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. When we think about these words that Paul had brought out here before us within this text, we can no doubt see that there has been a call that has been set forth before each and every one of us. That is that within our lives today, and whatever it is that we are going about, whatever it is that we are doing, that we realize that we are to be glorifying God through the very actions of our lives. As we think about what it is that Paul was saying within this verse, it's really a simple verse. And what I mean by that is it tells us like it is. It tells us that our lives within themselves, as we have been called to glorify God, that our lives in their entirety, that they are to be that testament of God's greatness. You see, as being that light that Keith had read about a few moments ago from the book of Matthew, when we look at that of our lives today as Christians, when we look at that today as being believers of God, That as we go about in this world around us, as we talk to people around us, as we kind of work with other people or go to school with people, wherever it may be that we are at, one of the things that we must find and understand is that we are to be that testament of God's greatness. We are to let that Christian light shine. We are, in other words, to be that good example unto the people who were around us. Now, when we look at this and we think about all that was brought forth within these words of Paul, Paul understood here that the Greco-Roman world was looking at the Christians there in Corinth. So as he had brought forth those words unto them, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all in the glory of God, what Paul understood was that the people were watching the Christians, watching every move that they had made. They were scrutinizing everything that they were doing, even slandering them for standing up and doing things that were right at times and would even bring in conflict. I don't know if it's much different for us today. It may be that we do not find ourselves in that exact situation, but no doubt we do find ourselves within a world today to where there's a lot of difficulty. We find that there will be people who may make fun of other kids who follow after the way of God. There may be things like that that even take place within the workplace and so forth and so on. And I believe as we look at that, we can realize that there is a great reality within. But the thing about it is Paul was telling them here, and whatever they do, and all things that they do to bring that glory to God, we should know, in essence, people are watching us. That's what Paul's talking about. There's people watching us, watching every move that it is that we make in our lives today. And remembering that we are to be that testament, that we are to be that light, that we are to be different, it really goes to show us that we ought to be that type of people to where we indeed are setting that good example. You know, when it gets down to it, we need the good, all the goodwill that we can get to be good people and to be a good example. When we think about that, and again, in light of the world today, we know that it has its many challenges that no doubt are brought forth, but what we have to do is stay devoted. And I would say that to every teacher, to every student, to everyone for that matter that is around others, that we really work to keep that devotion. Because no doubt the stress, no doubt the difficulties, no doubt the hardships, the scrutiny, and everything that comes our way at times can pull us down. But don't let that happen. Look to God and look and understand the strength that indeed that is found within God. I realize that this world that we are living in is one that is full of so much sin, if you will, trouble, pain, suffering. We are living today of the world. We're not in the world for that. We're in the world, but we need not to be of the world today. We need not to be living within the way that people live. But again, what that is telling us within this thought that we have before us is that we are to be about a life to where we are glorifying God, to where we are doing what it is that God has called us to do. And so, as we think about that, again, we have to remember those words of Paul, where he tells us, whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. We think about that. We find that bringing this glory to God, it's really about being able to pull ourselves out of, again, the ways of this world. It's so easy to get maybe stuck within that, trapped within. That's something that can't happen and shouldn't happen with us. It's there within that text, though, that we find at the beginning where it says, whether, therefore, ye eat or drink or whatsoever you do. When we think about that, of this idea here of eating and drinking, what we find is that in essence is telling us not to be devoting ourselves, if you look at it literally here, to the tables of the demons. But what that is telling us, and that's talking about sin, I should say, but what that is telling us is that as we go about our lives here within this world, don't live as the world lives. Don't do the things that the world's doing. Be the difference. Glorify God. And whatever you do the things that glorify God. Now, whenever we think about this, there's one restoration teacher that he had said this concerning the very idea that we are discussing. He said, whatever communicates or advances Christ And the idea, of course, brought out is that we look at our lives, whatever level we may be on, whatever we are doing, we need to be communicating in such a way that we are advancing the cause of Christ, that we are truly being that light, that we are truly being that good example unto everyone who is around us. And as we think about what is brought out within this is what we need to be about. But we also need to do all to the glory of God. That's what we're talking about. That's what's being said here within this text, that in all things that we do, that it needs to be for the glory of God. As we think about that, we may ask the question, well, how do we glorify God? Whenever we look at that very question or thought within itself, it's important for us to know that God has called us to be Christians. He has called us to be his followers. I say that in the sense that oftentimes what happens with people is that they really want to be godly around other godly people. But yet, when they're thrown into the world, at times it's just easier to kind of merge in with the world and live that way. But remember, Paul is saying, don't do that. Don't live within that manner. But in all things, everything that you do, glorify God. When we look at that of our lives, when we think about it as Christians, I mean, we just can't be Sunday only Christians and be pleasing to God. I mean, that's a reality that is set forth and a reality that we need to understand. If we're going to glorify God, it takes more than us just taking and checking in to church once a week. It's about a lifestyle. It's about a way of living for God for that matter. So whenever we think about that idea that we are discussing here, it's like when you go to school as students, you get to take a break from being God's children. You give an example. I mean, you're given opportunity after opportunity to be that example of Christ unto those who are around you. You are to be that testament. You are to be that light that is shining. And as we look at that, the reality is for all of us that we just don't get a break in the Christian walk. We don't get to take time away. Like when we look at this, what we have to understand, again, as I've said, Christianity is that lifestyle. And it's something that really we need to be striving to do. So we ask that question within itself then, well, how do we glorify God? Because if we look at life, and we ought to look at life this way, life within itself is this arena of our faith. So, in essence, what we are doing when we walk about, faith ought to be glowing from us. That light ought to be glowing. We ought to be that example. But as we're going and as we're living out our lives, there will be days that we will be tested. There will be days that we will be refined. But through it all, we've got to let that light shine. So as we look at the very question of how do we glorify God, first it begins with our attitudes. As we think about what is brought forth within this, it's important that we always have the right attitude. As we think about that of students and the way that you go about, again, this can apply to all different levels of life, but approach your studies with diligence. Recognize this. This is something I didn't want to do when I was younger. I regret it, I'll be honest with you. But we need to recognize the ability that we have to learn is a gift from God. God's given that to us. God's given us the understanding and the knowledge, and we ought to put that to work for that matter. Another way that we can glorify Him by having the right attitude would be that to treat teachers correctly. To treat the teachers with respect, the respect that they deserve, to be among your peers and even treat them equally, not to pick at people, tear people down, but to be able to really carry yourself in such a way, again, that your light is shining. It's about respect. It's about love. I believe it would be true, as I've had many teachers say it to me and others, but when you take and you look at the school systems today, a lot of this is gone. There's just not the kind of respect that needs to exist now. And whenever we look at this, that ought not to be coming from Christians, not to come from anybody for that matter. But as we think about that of your your status as a Christian or your status as a child that belongs unto God, realize that, again, you are that representative of God. Give that respect to your teachers. Give that respect to the other people that are around you. But another thing we talk about as it begins with that of the attitude is that God is glorified when we are striving to be Christ-like. We think about that of Galatians in chapter 5. In Galatians chapter 5, in verses 22 and 23, we find these words that in many ways we're familiar with, where it says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, and faith, meekness, and temperance. Against such there is no law." We find that God is glorified whenever we are able to be, when you are able to be students of patience and you have that kindness and that self control. So when you're in the middle of all of those academic pressures, or if we're in the middle of work, or if we're in the middle of life, or however it applies to us, when we are able to keep ourselves centered upon God and following after that with the right attitude, then we're going to be glorifying God. And that's the ultimate goal of each and every one of us. It's about bringing that light into the world around us, as it was read earlier. When we think about that responsibility within itself, it's one that is of a great responsibility. Because what being the light suggests is that it's simply a declaration of our identity. It tells the world that we are of Christ. If you start reading through the book of John there, chapter 1, and you read there in verses 4 and 5, you go to verse 8 or chapter 8 and verse 12, and you read, you find there that it talks about Jesus Christ being the light. It talks about how that the light shines within the darkness. And that reality that is set forth within all of that is who we need to be when we think about that in Matthew in chapter 5 and verse 14. That as we are that light unto the world today, that's exactly what we need to be, shining among others, being that testament. That's the word we used earlier, being that testament of Jesus Christ to other people. Can we do that if we're acting just like the world acts? I mean, we're not to eat and drink as the world or with the world. We're to be different in that sense. We're to be people who are setting a positive example, people who are who within us are allowing the fruit of the Spirit to really be seen among those who are around us, that we are glorifying God within that sense. But as we look at this again, it's not just a suggestion. This is what God is telling us to do, because light dispels darkness. Our lights that we can shine as Christians can illuminate that path for others. What it does is it reveals God's goodness. It lets people see who God is and what God is about, for that matter. And all of that is seen within our lives today. I realize that's a challenge. Well, I'm not in a school system, by no means on a daily basis or any at all anymore. But really, when it gets down to it, I realize that there's a lot of difficulty that takes place within that of a school. And as I think about that environment within itself of the school today, and I've heard this over and over throughout the years, but I still believe this to be true. The school environment today is probably uh, more diverse than what it's ever been. So many of the rights of teachers being taken away, telling them and really holding them what they can do and can't do, can say, can't say. Things along that line. As some of these stories have been told to me, and some of these limitations that's put upon them. And then you take and you look at that of the children going to school, and just about anything and everything in so many ways has been accepted by society. And then you have that within that there's this big call to accept me as I am sort of deal. That brings a lot of added stress, not only to the teachers and the staff, but also to that of the students. It's tough to hear a child come home and say, I had to sit beside a person that identifies as an animal. To think about that. That's our school system now. My reply was, tell them that you're allergic to that animal and you need to move. I mean, if they're going to honor them, they ought to honor you. But if you take and you think about what is brought forth within this, there's so many challenges. But in those challenges, as hard, as difficult as they are, be the light, be the example. Because here's the reality. Many of the teachers you may be around, many of the students you may be around, they have never taken a foot or a step into a church building. Maybe they don't know much about God, or they've chose not to know much about God. Maybe there's something that you can do that could change that. Maybe there's an influence that you can ponder that can make that difference, because you just don't know. Whenever you look at this and we think about what is brought forth, it's about being that light, right? It's about letting that light shine, whether it be for a student, whether it be for those of us at work or wherever it may be. But I suppose when it gets down to it, we have to look in a sense and examine ourselves to see where we are at. Are we that flickering light? Are we a light that's extinguished easily by the pressures, the distractions, or are we the kind of light that is steady? That truly we are that radiant beacon, that we are leading others unto God, that we are glorifying God throughout the way that we live our lives. Because as we think about this, it's in the book of Philippians in chapter 2. We have these words. It says, do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. You think about the lights that we are letting to shine, the example that we are being unto others. Remember, we are in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. We're in darkness, and we have been called to be the lights. Let's quickly look at some practical ways that we can be the light, but also the ways that students can be the light. Do your best. Do your best for your studies as we apply it unto students. Sometimes, when it comes down to it, it's just about, well, let me get the good grade and be done and get out of here. But be diligent. Goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Be honest within that of the assignments that you are given. Don't be cheating, don't be plagiarizing, and don't be compromising your integrity in any way just to get a grade. But really be diligent to God, fulfilling what it is that God has called you to do. Remember, as it is taught in Ecclesiastes 9:10, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do with thy might. Another area that one can be practical is to take and to show kindness and compassion, things that we have talked about. We know that Matthew chapter 22 and verse 39, that it talks about that of letting our love indeed exist among that of our neighbors. To love our neighbor as ourselves is what we understand within that teaching. Be friendly. There's always new students that need friends. There's always new students that need encouragement. There's always other students that are struggling. Be friendly. Be there to help. And don't overlook people for that matter, but try to be that light that shines upon all. Offer that helping hand when someone is struggling. Encourage them in the difficulties in which they might be facing. But again, always remembering within that Jesus' command to love thy neighbor as thyself. Another way is to respect the authority, as we've talked about. In Romans 13 and verse 1, we find often applied unto that of government, but it applies unto that of also what we find within that sense of the higher power. But honor your teachers, honor your administrators, your school staff, obey the rules. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes we don't like that stuff, but still we've got to do what is right in the sight of God. There may be things that we disagree with, but do so respectfully. It goes a long way. We think about that in Romans 13:1, it says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. This is something, again, that we have to remember why it applies and often taken and applied into the government. I believe we can understand the idea within itself. Another area is to maintain purity in speech and your conduct. And as we look at that, we find, let your words be gracious. In other words, let your word be uplifting. Avoid the gossip, avoid the profanity, avoid the crude jokes that Christians ought not to be involved in. Stand firm against that peer pressure. Don't engage in the eating and drinking, if you would, of the world and those behaviors. It's just like what we're told in Ephesians in chapter 4 and verse 29. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. You see, it's about being that person that no doubt is great, that grace can be seen in because one is Christ-like. That is what God has called for out of each and every one. But to be ready to give an answer, you might think, well, that's kind of an odd one, but not really. Whenever you look at you living your life, if your faith is open and people can see that you love God, someone's going to ask. Someone's going to ask you about God, and be ready to give that answer. In 1 Peter 3:15, it says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. When you have that hope, when that light is shining, people are to be naturally drawn into that light. That's the whole teaching that we find within that of the scriptures here. And as we think about that, that then provides unto us opportunities. And then finally, pray for your school community. I don't know how often people do this or not, but to me, prayer is a very powerful thing. I know we pray every morning for Alana, I guess now goes to school as Jacob is no longer home. But whenever we take and we look at this, pray for your teachers, pray for your classmates, pray for the atmosphere of the school. There's already so many challenges there. I think about the words in Philippians 4:6, and I'm taking this from the American Standard Bible. It says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by power and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. That's what we need to do, is to pray to God about all that we are going through, all that we are dealing with. And again, this is something that is true in the school, but it's true at work, it's true in life. When we look at our lives today, the reality is we have been called to be that shining light, to be that example unto others. Some might not be too happy about going back to school, but it is an opportunity for you to learn, to better yourself, to prepare yourself for life. But also, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to let your light shine. It's an opportunity to let Christ be seen within you. As we think about those opportunities that set out before us, one of the greatest opportunities given unto man is salvation. And it is because of a light. It's because of the light, according to John 1. It's because of Jesus Christ, who came to expel that darkness, as we think about 8:12. We find that he did that in order to be able to provide unto each and every one of us through grace his opportunity. He's given us that opportunity of salvation. What we must do is hear the gospel, believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, repent of the sins that we have within, to confess Jesus, to be baptized into that grave of water, but then to live for him. If you have not been baptized into Christ, come into him. Be baptized while you have opportunity. If it is that you have been baptized into Christ, and maybe you've fallen away, or maybe you've not been living for God in the way you ought to live,